Alrighty, so a YouTuber called Matthew Mayornik, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, recently put out a video called should clock be removed from the World Cube Association? Thought it was an interesting video, and I thought it was worth adding my perspective as a relatively new organizer and trainee delegate. I'm from the South African community, and most recently was involved in African Championships about 2 or 3 weeks ago as one of the primary MCs of the event, and my interest as an organizer particularly is on scheduling and trying to keep events on track. So that's kind of my perspective. I'm also somebody, I would say, who doesn't care at all about clock. And if we're asking my personal opinion, would love to see it removed. But I do think I have some counterpoints to bring against the arguments that Matt raised in this video. So I thought I'd just continue the conversation by throwing this up on the internet. Let's go for it.
I recently put out a community poll to see the community's thoughts on this. A majority of people said that they would like to keep clock.
72% in favor of clock is wild. I think that's more people than have competed in clock in the WCA. That would be my guess. We usually see at our competitions maybe 20% of the total registered competitors competing in clock. That might be a bit of a high number. I would be very interested if that's not higher than the percentage of people who actually compete in clock.
But when they gave their reasoning, they stated that they didn't like it, wouldn't add it if it...
Okay, I don't think we should remove clock. If it wasn't an event, I wouldn't add it, but clock has its place in the WCA, and it's not as repetitive as Magic or as awful to run as Feet, so it would be a bad move. To all the people who really like clock, and it's not going to negatively affect comps in the future, as it's ran the same as any other event. True, except... I mean, it uses the same infrastructure. Obviously, it has different scramble sets and different kind of regulations, but I'm sure we'll get into that.
It wasn't already an event, but don't think it's necessary to remove it. Of the people who were passionate about clock, they gave other reasons. People said that removing an event has no benefit to the community, and that it screws over the people who have spent time learning clock. For the first part of this argument, it's easy to see that removing...
Okay, so let's read this quickly. Ben Stokes is a relatively accomplished speed cuber from the UK, as far as I'm aware. I'm still fairly new to all of this, but the name definitely rings a bell. Nothing should be removed. Removing the event will never have any benefit to competitors. All it does is remove an opportunity for something to compete in. I think never have any benefit to competitors. As soon as you're making such absolute statements, I think you're in dangerous territory. But to give them the benefit of the doubt, you could change the phrasing to is very unlikely to have any benefit to competitors, and it still makes the same general point. Remove an opportunity for something to compete in, and even if there was some minor reasons to remove it, it's still a massive, I assume that's going to say fuck you, to those of us who have put a lot of time into the puzzle. We should be adding events. That's much more exciting. Okay, I have thoughts on adding events. I'll throw them in there if we don't get to it in the course of this video. But I do think that I would disagree with the notion that there's no benefit from removing an event, right? Because it acts on the assumption that there's no opportunity cost to having an event. Opportunity cost is a term that essentially refers to whatever you're giving up by making a decision. So if you decide to spend, $10 on a packet of chips, your opportunity cost is all of the things you could have done with those $10 instead, right? So if we're having clock, we are then not having other rounds of other events. So depending on how badly we want to have other rounds of other events, we could see, we could see some sort of benefit there.
An event has great benefits. If you were to eat pizza, each slice you eat has less and less benefit to your overall satisfaction. At a certain point, having the 18th slice of pizza does more harm than good. It causes you to get sick and
weak
throw
stomach.
up. If you keep adding events and never removing them, it doesn't just only add benefit. At a certain point, it has a cost to the community.
I think this is a really great point. What he's speaking about here is kind of an economics concept, I think, which is the idea of like diminishing marginal returns. And I think it certainly rings true here, right? Like, we clearly can't add, I think he says this later in the video, we clearly can't have infinite events in the WCA. Like, if we need to run a championship and we're operating on the assumption that every event has to happen at a championship, there is some logical limit of events that we would need to have. And especially if you want to have multiple rounds of different events, there's only so many events we could possibly have in the WCA. And my opinion as an organizer is we are very close to that limit, if not already over it. Fitting a reasonable amount of rounds and attempts for all 17 WCA events into 3 days at a championship is already really hard. You either need to have really long days, be very strict on how many rounds of different events you allow, or be absolutely cracked at scheduling and running multiple stages and that kind of thing, which I think is something they've done a lot in the US particularly. But yeah, I think at 17, we're pretty much at the point where we need to have 4-day competitions for there to be time for staff and organizers to be sane during competitions. We are very much at the limit, in my opinion. And the notion of adding events, we're just not there. I don't think that we have the kind of organizational capacity with the way events are currently set up for us to think about adding more events.
Wouldn't we just add every puzzle in existence to the WCA if there was only benefit? At a certain point, there will be too many events in the WCA.
Yeah, and I think it's easy to paint what he's saying here as a reduction to the absurd. Like, obviously we wouldn't add every puzzle in the world. Like, that's a bit of a straw man of the argument from, people who want to add more events. But I think what he's actually doing is drawing what we call a line of acceptability, right? Like, we all agree that we can't have infinite puzzles or every puzzle in existence in the WCA. That just, hopefully we can all agree that isn't practical. So what he's saying essentially is we all agree we can't have everything, so there has to be some line somewhere that we draw, and the question then is, where exactly do we draw that line?
Just like there's too much pizza to eat. The second part of this argument is more compelling. The last thing you want to do is take away a lot of people's hard work. But as we can see, with the removal of feet, other organizations, such as extraevents.org, have kept the feet community alive.
This is a pretty weak argument. I don't think that a lot of events get run as extra events, and I don't think many people care about extra events either.
As well,
although arguably, the fact that not many extra events get run is perhaps a commentary on either people aren't very interested in extra events, which I think is a very real possibility, but I think it also speaks to how packed WCA competitions are. There really isn't a lot of space to put in other stuff. So thinking about putting in extra events is very difficult, I think, for most organizers.
As other communities. This allows for people to still get official times while keeping the event out of major championships.
I mean, it's not an official time. Yeah, like by definition, if it's not as far as how I would define official is recognized by the WCA. So if it's not recognized by the WCA, I would define it as unofficial. I assume what he means is get times in competition settings on competition equipments. Which fair enough, I guess.
Eats away at precious time to hold other more popular events. Some arguments that were against clock that were in the poll stated that clock is the only non-twisty puzzle related event in the WCA. Another being that clock is harder to judge. The judging process forces the judge to touch the puzzle and possibly tamper with its state in order to confirm it's solved.
Not something I've seen issues with in practice. I read delegate report threads pretty avidly. And we certainly haven't experienced it in any of our competitions, although I think I've delegated like 5 rounds of clock max. But yeah, I also haven't seen mention of it in any delegate reports, even from kind of championships and that kind of thing. But I'm open to being wrong.
That alone could have an effect on the consistency of clock results being recorded properly. From my perspective as a broadcaster, all other cubes can be commentated on and people can visibly see the steps of the solve. For clock, all you get is the flip. You can't see the dials of the clock or where the puzzle state is at all during the solve. How do we expect to grow cubing as a sport if even the people who know the sport can't even effectively describe what's going on?
So this is an interesting point, which is essentially growing cubing by making it more spectator friendly. I could probably make a whole flipping video on this, but essentially I question the premise that we need to make cubing spectator friendly in order to grow it at all. I think we're seeing cubing grow, so it depends how we define growth. I think we're seeing cubing grow very naturally, just with competitor interest post-COVID. We're certainly at the stage where major areas are really struggling to keep up with new competitor demand. Somebody quoted the stat on the forums that 5,000 new competitors have tried to register but not been able to find competitions to register for this year. So from a competitor numbers perspective, I certainly don't think growth is something we need to focus on at all, because it's happening naturally, right? I also question whether growth is necessarily a positive thing. I would ask, what is wrong with the current state in terms of numbers and regularity of competitions that we have? We're having 100-person competitions in South Africa. I'm happy with that. I'm fine with that. As an organizer, that's probably the sweet spot in terms of how many people you want attending. As competitors, we have a healthy, thriving competition scene. What we could probably use more of is organizers and delegates, but we don't get that by bringing more newcomers into cubing. That just increases the burden, the burden on existing organizers and delegates. The way we get that is by creating effective pipelines in our communities to mentor organizers and having regular competitions to the point that people who are competitors in their tween or teen years eventually grow up and become organizers and delegates and start contributing and giving back to the community. So that's more of what I would see as a longevity thing than a growth thing necessarily. There is another way we could define growth, which is in terms of the finances and sponsorships available to competitions and the WCA. And essentially, I think the idea goes that if cubing is a highly spectator-friendly event, or if it's very spectator-friendly to watch cubing competitions, then cubing will grow to an audience of very casual cubers or even non-cubers, and more eyeballs on live streams and that kind of thing could attract greater sponsorships in the space. Now, again, I would love to see more substantiation around why we need more money in the space in the first place. I'm not necessarily the hugest fan of commercialization of things and sponsors getting involved. I really like the community element that we have going at the moment, and I'm not necessarily convinced I would love to see that change radically with corporate sponsors. But even if we do want that, I question the degree to which cubing can be spectator friendly. And even if it can be, do all puzzles need to be spectator friendly? So there's just a bunch of questions here. So first of all, let's talk about, do all puzzles need to be spectator friendly? I don't necessarily think that or all events rather, I don't think that all 17 of the WCA events need to be spectator friendly in order for it to be interesting for spectators to view. I think it's very reasonable to imagine that there are a certain core of events that spectators enjoy watching. One-handed, 2, 3, 4, perhaps blindfolded, perhaps mega, a couple shape mods. We can quite easily imagine a core of 6 to 8 events that happen over 3 hours easily in a day of competing that could attract viewers. And to me, that seems like enough. We don't necessarily need every single event to have spectators on the edge of their seat all the time. So if we have that core, I don't have a massive issue with there being other puzzles that aren't as easy to figure out what's going on. But also, how can any casual spectator really understand what's going on, and how can any commentator really explain what's going on in how quickly a 3x3 solve or a clock solve happens, right? These things are happening in like 5 to 10 seconds. And all like that means all a commentator can do is really name the stages that somebody's going through. Like, okay, cross done, F12 done, OLL, PLL skip, whatever. So all they can do is use terminology that is already familiar to existing cubers and is quite alien to casual spectators. And I don't think that for cubing to be spectator friendly, spectators need to be able to follow the solves, because we have this huge display showing the time, and when we have a solve happening as quickly as 5 to 10 seconds, that's short enough that one doesn't really need to be invested in the specifics of the solve. What you're invested in is how quickly is this person turning and when's the timer going to stop. Like, your attention is held for 5 seconds watching somebody solve clock, So, yeah, all that in mind, I don't necessarily think that we need to grow cubing. I don't necessarily think that cubing needs to be spectator friendly in order to grow. Even if it needs to be spectator friendly, I don't think that seeing the specific stages of very quick puzzles contributes meaningfully to spectator friendliness. That's my argument.
Clock in itself has really no correlation to any other event.
Yeah. Does clock skills transfer over to any other event? Nope.
As a community, do we remove an event in order?
So he doesn't really expand on that point, but I assume the implication is if clock skills don't transfer to any other event, it doesn't really have a place in the WCA or something to that degree. For me personally, I am not convinced that the skills for an event should necessarily be transferable. In fact, I would probably argue more in favor of an event's lineup that creates a bunch of niches where people can develop quite specific skills that apply to certain puzzles, rather than highly generalizable skills. For example, as much as I love Max Park, once you've watched him win 3x3 and 4x4 and maybe even 5x5, it's not like particularly interesting to also then watch him win 6 and 7, right? And from a competitiveness perspective, so that's a spectator friendliness perspective, from a competitive perspective, like big cubes is a whole category of puzzles, and arguably even 3 upwards is a whole category of puzzles where the skills are so similar that if somebody is just significantly better than you in one of them, you can't really be competitive. Like if you're both practicing the same amount and they're just better than you, there's not a reasonable track to competitiveness, as opposed to if there's a completely different class of puzzles that have their own niche skills, then you can choose to focus exclusively on kind of that puzzle and become very good in one area. And that can be like a very satisfying process for people. So I'm much more interested in puzzles that have niches that allow more competitors to develop different specialities and create a more interesting ecosystem for spectators and competitors alike.
To make the sport more spectator friendly and consistent.
I'm just gonna
Over to any other event? Nope.
As a community, do we remove an event in order to make the sport more spectator friendly and consistent? Do we really want to spend the already limited?
He hasn't really made me understand why we should care about consistency, I would say.
Time at major championships to go to 3 to 4 hours of clock rounds instead of relays and other events that
3 to 4 hours of clock rounds? Who's holding 3 to 4 hours of clock rounds? Okay, so we're looking at Oceanic Championship, filtered for clock. 1 hour 10 plus 20 minutes. That's 1.5 hours of clock rounds over an entire continental championship. Okay, now we're looking at North American champs. This is 1 hour 40 plus 30 minutes. So this is just over 2 hours. So it might look like I'm nitpicking, but yeah, I think at African Champs we spent about an hour on clock. Obviously because we have far fewer competitors. But yeah, I think we're talking about saving 2 hours over the course of an entire championship weekend maximum. 3 to 4 is, I would say, a bit misleading and a bit of an overestimation.
3 to 4 hours of clock rounds instead of relays and other events that grow the sport more. At what point do we just let go?
So I don't necessarily agree that removing clock is a solution, but I do think that there are things we can do to mitigate some of the issues, some of the very valid issues that have been raised here. First of all, we can make clock easier for organizers to hold and easier for judges to manage by removing pin misalignment as a scramble requirement. As far as I understand, it's not a requirement for the solved state, so it's a bit weird that it is a requirement for the scrambled state. And so many of the organizer headaches and weird special covers we need and that kind of thing come from that requirement to have the clocks be in the correct position. And removing that makes it much easier to hold the event, makes delegates need to grant far less extras and that sort of thing, and makes the whole event run more smoothly. So I think that's a big regulation change we could make that would make clock much more pleasant. Then I think there's the broader discussion around adding new events, removing existing events, the amount of time everything takes at championships, and I think the best option I've heard there, the first time I heard it was on the Layer by Layer podcast with Kit Clement and I think Andrew Nathanson, where they essentially spoke about a tiered event system, where we have, for example, tier 1 events. Those are our core events that we always hold, that never rotate out. Those are, 3x3. I don't even want to name others. Definitely 3x3. And then we can kind of quibble on what the others would be. Tier 2 events, which are essentially events that are currently in rotation. So all tier 1 and tier 2 events would be held at major championships. And then tier 3 events are events that are out of rotation, but that will be rotated in the future. And what that does is I think it does a bunch of quite interesting things. Firstly, it lowers the total number of events that need to be held at championships, which makes the lives of organizers much easier. It also creates more variety in the events pool, which I think is more interesting for competitors, especially fairly new competitors, because at the moment with 17 static events, everything is just getting super optimized, and especially if you're a new cuber in the States on the West Coast or something, you just aren't competitive, and it's going to take you years to be competitive in anything. So if we're every, year or 2 years introducing new puzzles that are completely unoptimized for the most part, that top competitors haven't necessarily practiced, it creates interesting world record progression, it creates interest in method development, it gives new and old cubers something new to practice, and there'll be varying levels of skill transfer across the different new puzzles, but I think that makes for a more interesting competing landscape for competitors particularly, which is something I'd be very excited for. The other thing it does is, especially if these additions of puzzles are being announced in regulations changes, for example, it gives savvy manufacturers the opportunity to start developing their hardware before the puzzle actually comes into WCA rotation, because we can expect these things to be announced at least 3 to 6 months, I would imagine, before they actually come into effect. Which, gives manufacturers the opportunity to start developing good hardware before the puzzle's actually in the WCA, and competitors interested in trying something new the opportunity to start grinding before competitions happen. So, but my particular focus there is on hardware development, because one of the major criticisms people have is that new events have bad hardware, right? But that's a bit of a chicken and egg situation, because the reason new events have bad hardware is because it's not very profitable for manufacturers to create good hardware for them because the interest is low. So if we're essentially telling manufacturers ahead of time, hey, this event's getting added to the WCA, it's going to be held at, major championships for the next 2 years, there will be a market for it. That then breaks us out of that chicken and egg loop, and it lets them know, okay, whoever's first to the party with a very high quality piece of hardware for this event is going to make a lot of money because every cuber is going to want to buy it. So I think that helps to break the bad hardware cycle and makes it more possible to rotate in new events, especially once we see that prophecy starting to fulfill itself, which is what I think we might. Yeah, so those are essentially my thoughts. I think there is a good case for clock to be removed, but I don't think that it's compelling enough to actually remove it, especially when so many cubers and even non-clock competitors are interested in keeping it. So I would say let's change the regulations and let's solve the broader issue, which is the static events roster, by really starting to focus on a tiered event system. And the best way to do that is either get on the forums and start advocating for this, or like apply to WRC or something and start seeing if you can provide the capacity that volunteer team needs to take on the regulation changes that something like this would entail.